Muriye Zimbabwe. Welcome back pamzinda wevanhu neni wenyu Super Nexus in this evening broadcast. And we're going to break down the full list yema 10 senators matsva akasarudzwa na President Mnangagwa neparliament yavo. Right, so Zimbabwe has just received 10 new senators, and at first glance it might look like a routine parliamentary development, but when you look at the names, the backgrounds, the political positions, and the different worlds these people come from, you start seeing a much bigger picture. President Emmerson Mnangagwa has recommended 10 people for appointment to the Senate following the constitutional changes that expanded Zimbabwe's Senate from 80 members to 90. Parliament has now approved those appointments, and among the 10 are powerful ZANU-PF figures, former government officials, a retired senior military officer, a prominent businessman, and people with strong provincial and political backgrounds. So today, Zimbabwe, we are going to do something different. We are going to take all 10 names one by one. Look at who these people actually are. Look at their political and professional backgrounds, and then ask the big question, why might Mnangagwa have chosen each of them? And we are starting with the name that has probably attracted the most attention. Number 1, Kudakwashe Tagwirei. Let's start with the elephant in the room. Kudakwashe Tagwirei. If you have been following Zimbabwean politics, you already know that Tagwirei is not simply an ordinary businessman. He has become one of the most politically prominent business figures associated with the Mnangagwa era. For much of his career, his influence came from business, but in recent years, his relationship with the political establishment has become increasingly visible. Tagwirei has served as a presidential advisor and later entered formal ZANU-PF politics. He was co-opted into the ZANU-PF Central Committee in 2025, and now he has been appointed the Senate. That is a remarkable transition. Businessman, political advisor, ZANU-PF Central Committee member, now senator. And that naturally raises the question, why did Mnangagwa choose him? The official answer is that these new senators are appointed under the constitutional provision governing the additional seats. But politically, Tagwirei's background gives him something unusual. He understands business. He has experience dealing with government. He has relationships inside the political establishment. And now he has formal legislative experience. That could make him useful to a government trying to connect economic policy, business, and politics. But this is where we have to separate fact from speculation. There has been widespread speculation that Tagwirei could eventually play a much larger political role, with some reports even describing him as a possible future president. That is speculation, not an announced succession plan. His Senate appointment does not prove that Mnangagwa has selected him as a successor, but it does show that Tagwirei is moving deeper into formal politics. Zimbabwe. And that alone makes this one of the most interesting appointments on the list. Number 2, Jabulani Sibanda. This is a completely different kind of political figure. Sibanda is a prominent ZANU-PF figure and war veteran. He also serves as the ruling party's chairperson in Bulawayo province. And that background matters because the Liberation War generation has historically occupied an important place within ZANU-PF's political identity. Sibanda therefore brings something that Tagwirei does not: deep political history and veteran credentials. He is also a figure with experience in the politics of Bulawayo. That gives his appointment a regional dimension. So, Why might Mnangagwa want someone like Sibanda in the Senate? One possibility is representation of the Liberation War generation. Another is strengthening links between the national government and ZANU-PF's structures in Bulawayo. And another is simply experience. Sibanda understands the internal politics of ZANU-PF in a way that someone entering politics from business simply cannot. So Tagwirei, while Tagwirei represents a newer form of political influence, Sibanda represents an older political tradition. And putting both men into the same Senate tells you something about the range of experience Mnangagwa is bringing into the chamber. Right, number 3, Tina Godwills Masimirembwa. Now, we move to this guy. This is another appointment with an obvious party political dimension. Masimirembwa is the chairperson of ZANU-PF's Harare province. And that is a very important position. Why? Because Harare is Zimbabwe's capital. It is the country's biggest political and administrative center. It is also one of the most politically contested areas in Zimbabwe. So having the ZANU-PF provincial chairperson from Harare entering the Senate is significant. Masimirembwa isn't simply bringing parliamentary experience. He brings knowledge of the ruling party's organization in the capital. Right, Zimbabwe. He understands the party structures. And he has been involved in the political debate around the country's future. So why might Mnangagwa have chosen him? The obvious answer is political experience and party organization. If the new Senate is going to become an important part of Zimbabwe's evolving political system, having experienced party leaders inside it can be valuable, and Harare is simply too important for the ruling party to ignore. Right, number 4, Mary Mliswa. Now, let's talk about Mary Mliswa. Mliswa is another important ZANU-PF provincial figure. She has served as chairperson of ZANU-PF in Mashonaland West, making a part of the ruling party's provincial leadership structure. A political background gives this appointment another interesting dimension, because when you look at the list, you don't just see national level figures, you see people connected to provincial political structures, and that could be important. ZANU-PF is a huge organization. Presidents don't govern through Harare alone. Provincial structures are where political organization actually happens on the ground. So bringing people with provincial experience into parliament can provide the Senate with politicians who understand what is happening beyond the capital. For Mnangagwa, that kind of experience can be useful. Mliswa also brings the perspective of a woman who has occupied a significant position within the party. So, her appointment potentially adds both provincial and gender representation to the new Senate. Again, we cannot know the president's private reasoning, but her political background gives us a reasonable explanation for why she could be considered valuable. Number 5, Zimbabwe, Nokutula Matanyire. Nokutula Matanyire. Her political background is particularly interesting because she has experience at both parliamentary and provincial government level. She has represented Chimanimani West and has also served as a Minister of State for Manicaland's provincial affairs and devolution. That gives her something very important: government experience. Think about what that means. She has experience as a legislator. She has experience in provincial administration. She has experience dealing with government structures. And now she is moving into the Senate. That creates a fairly obvious argument for her appointment. The Senate is not supposed to be simply a room full of politicians making speeches. It is part of the country's legislative system. So having people who understand how government actually operates can be useful. Matanyire therefore represents another category on this list. Experienced government administrators. And that is different from the Tagwirei appointment. Tagwirei brings business experience, Sibanda brings veteran and party history, Masimirembwa brings provincial party organization, Matanyire brings parliamentary and provincial government experience. The pattern is becoming clearer. Number 6, General Gibson Mashingaidze. Now, we get to one of the most interesting backgrounds on the list, retired General Gibson Mashingaidze. Mashingaidze is a former senior military officer and a figure associated with Zimbabwe's war veteran structures. That immediately makes this appointment politically interesting because Zimbabwe's military and liberation war history have always been closely connected to the country's political story. But again, we need to be careful. Having a retired military officer in parliament does not mean the military is taking over parliament. It doesn't prove some hidden political plan. What it does mean is that someone with extensive military and liberation era experience is now part of the Senate. And that experience can be valuable when Parliament is dealing with issues involving national security, veterans, defense, and the country's historical institutions. So, why might Mnangagwa have chosen him? Experience, veteran credentials, institutional knowledge, and the representation of an important constituency within the ruling establishment. Mashingaidze therefore adds another dimension to the Senate. Number 7, Makosini Shongwe, Zimbabwe. Right. This is another name with significant government experience. Shongwe previously served as a member of parliament and later as Minister of Youth, Sport, Arts and Recreation. That means he already understands parliament, he understands cabinet, he understands government administration, and he understands the political process from the inside. That makes his appointment relatively easy to understand. When a government expands an institution, it may want people who already know how that institution works. Shongwe has that experience. He has already been involved in national policy making. He knows the pressures of government and he knows how parliament functions. So, rather than seeing his appointment simply as bringing back an old politician, we can look at it as bringing institutional experience into the new Senate. And that may be exactly what Mnangagwa wanted. Number 8, Lucy Chitaga. Now we reach one of the lesser known names, Lucy Chitaga. And this is where the story gets particularly interesting because unlike Godwills Masimirembwa or Masimirembwa, Chitaga is not a name that dominates Zimbabwe's national political conversation. That doesn't mean the appointment is unimportant. In fact, it raises a different question. What expertise does Chitaga bring? The constitutional provision behind these appointments specifically focuses on skills and competencies. So when we look at a lesser known appointee, the important thing is not simply why haven't I heard of this person? The better question is what does this person know or represent that Mnangagwa believes belongs in the Senate? And that is something Zimbabweans will be able to judge as these senators begin performing their duties. Her appointment also demonstrates that this list isn't composed entirely of political celebrities. Some of the people being brought into the Senate are less nationally visible, and that suggests that professional or specialist considerations may have played a role alongside political considerations. Number 9, Brilliant Dube. Then comes Brilliant Dube, another name that many ordinary Zimbabweans may not immediately recognize. And again, that makes the appointment interesting because when a president chooses someone who isn't already one of the country's biggest political personalities, there has to be something about that individual that the appointing authority considers valuable. It could be expertise, it could be professional experience, it could be political work, it could be representation, or it could simply be the person's contribution to the broader political system. We shouldn't invent a reason when no official explanation has been given. But we can say that Dube's appointment shows that Mnangagwa wasn't simply filling the Senate with the most famous ZANU-PF names available. There is a mixture here. Some people are extremely well known, others are not. And that is one of the most interesting features of the entire list. Number 10, Irene Mutambra. And finally, Irene Mutumbra. Mutumbra completes the 10-person list. Like Chitaga and Dube, she is not currently as nationally recognizable as Tagwirei or Sibanda, and that means the appointment deserves a closer look as the work in the Senate becomes visible. The important point is that the 10 appointments appear to bring together different forms of experience. Not everyone has the same political background, not everyone comes from the same institution, not everyone has the same public profile, and that diversity could be intentional, or it could simply reflect the constitutional requirement for skills and competencies. Either way, these 10 people now have an opportunity to prove why they were chosen. Now, look at the bigger picture. This is where things become really interesting. Forget the individual names for a moment. Look at the pattern. You have a powerful businessman, a war veteran, provincial party leaders, a former provincial minister, a former cabinet minister, a retired senior military officer, and people whose backgrounds are less familiar to the general public. That's quite a mixture. And it tells us that this isn't simply a Senate made up of one type of political figure. It's a combination of political history, government experience, business, party organization, military and veteran credentials, and professional backgrounds. And that brings us to the biggest question. Why now? Why these 10? The official explanation is important. These 10 additional Senate seats exist because of the constitutional changes that expanded the Senate from 80 to 90 members. Parliament has approved the appointments recommended by Mnangagwa, so we shouldn't automatically assume every appointment contains a hidden political message. But politics is about context, and the context here is extraordinary. Zimbabwe has just undergone major constitutional changes. The political system is being reshaped, the country is looking toward 2030, and the people being placed into these new positions will become part of that new political environment. That means these 10 senators could become much more important than their titles initially suggest. Tagwirei is the biggest question mark. Of all 10, Tagwirei is probably the person who raises the biggest political questions. Not because we know he is being prepared to become president, we don't, but because his journey into formal politics has been unusual. He spent years building influence through business, then he became associated with the president's administration, then he entered ZANU-PF's Central Committee, now he is a senator. That is a clear progression, and Zimbabweans will naturally watch what happens next. Does he remain focused on economic and legislative issues? Does he become more active inside ZANU-PF? Does he receive additional responsibilities? Does his national profile continue growing, or does the Senate become the final destination? Those questions will answer themselves over time. The bigger story is the system, and perhaps this is the most important point. We shouldn't become so obsessed with the 10 individuals that we forget the institution they are entering. The Senate itself has changed, the Constitution has changed, the political timetable has changed, and Parliament's role in Zimbabwe's future political system has become an even more important subject of debate. That means these 10 senators are entering Parliament at a very unusual moment. They are not simply joining an old system. They are entering a system that is being reshaped. And whatever happens over the next few years, they will be part of that story. So why did ED pick them? If we had to summarize the possible logic behind the appointments without pretending to know Mnangagwa's private thoughts, we could say this. Jabulani Sibanda brings veteran and party experience. Mary Mliswa brings provincial political leadership. Matanyire brings parliamentary and provincial government experience. Kudakwashe Tagwirei brings major business experience and an increasingly prominent political profile. Godwills Masimirembwa brings leadership of ZANU-PF's Harare structure. Lucy Chitaga brings a less nationally prominent but potentially valuable professional or political background. Then Gibson Mashingaidze brings Senate senior military and veteran experience. Makosini Shongwe brings former ministerial and parliamentary experience. Brilliant Due adds another professional or political voice to the new chamber. And Irene Mutumbwa adds another perspective to the 10-person group. But here is the important part. Those are interpretations based on their public backgrounds. They are not confirmed statements of Mnangagwa's private motivations. Only Mnangagwa and his administration know exactly why each person was selected. And now the real story begins. These 10 people have received their appointments. The headlines have been written. The names have been announced. Parliament has approved them. But now comes the interesting part. What are they actually going to do? Who will become influential? Who will speak the most? Who will become a major voice in ZANU-PF? Who will surprise Zimbabweans? And who among these 10 will become much more important than people currently realize? Because history has a funny way of doing that. A person enter parliament relatively quiet and a few years later become one of the most important political figures in the country. And that is why this list deserves attention, especially because one of the 10 is already one of Zimbabwe's most politically discussed businessmen. The 2030 question, eventually, everything comes back to 2030. Not because we know what will happen in 2030, we don't, but because the people entering the political system today could still be major players when Zimbabwe reaches that point. The Senate is bigger, the constitutional framework is different, the political landscape is evolving, and these 10 people have just been given a front row seat. So perhaps this isn't really a story about 10 senators. Perhaps it is the beginning of a story about the next generation of Zimbabwe's political power structure. Maybe some of these people will remain senators and nothing more. Maybe others will become ministers. Maybe others will become party leaders. Maybe one or two will become major national figures. And perhaps one of the names that seems ordinary today will eventually become one of the biggest names in Zimbabwean politics. We simply don't know yet. But now, we know who to watch. Final thought, Zimbabwe. There you have it. 10 new senators, 10 different backgrounds, 10 different political stories, and 10 people who have now entered a rapidly changing Zimbabwean political system. From Jabulani Sibanda, the veteran political heavyweight, to Mary Mliswa and the provincial party structures, to Matanyire and her government experience, to Tagwirei, the businessman whose political rise is attracting enormous attention, to Masimirembwa representing ZANU-PF's Harare machinery, to Mashingaidze bringing military and veteran credentials, to Shongwe, the former minister, and the less nationally known figures whose political stories we are only beginning to understand. The question is no longer, who are these 10 people? We now know who they are. The bigger question is, what will they become? Because Mnangagwa has just placed 10 new pieces onto Zimbabwe's political chessboard, and nobody yet knows which one will become the most powerful. The next few years will tell us, and believe me, we are going to be watching every move. So Mrie Zimbabwe, there you have it. Thank you for watching. Rugare ngaruve nemi ndini wenyu Nexus ndabuda. Peace.